welcome everybody. Hopefully you are hearing me and seeing me. It's very dark in my room. I'm very, very pleased to introduce my countrymate. We've been very long friends for the last minute and a half because we haven't seen each other personally, but I've seen him on the screen. Patricio is a doctor in social sciences and the humanities, from the Universidad de Quilmes. He's the author Between Injury and Revolution, the Frente de Liberación Homosexual in Argentina. Is currently a Marie Curie postdoc at UCL, and you can guess from his credentials and the title of the book we're going to discuss today. He is working closely with Paulo in a project. I've heard something in the backstage, but I cannot, I don't know much, but I can't disclose. But seems to be as exciting as is the title of the book. That is going to be discussed by Ernesto Semán, who is a good friend and acquainted to the seminar. Ernesto is wearing a big woolen, but he's in the warmest part of Norway, on the warmest coast, on the rainiest coast of Norway. And Ernesto is an associate professor in the Department of Foreign Languages of the University of Bergen. He's the closest expert to populism that we have in this shore. And he's been in the seminar before. In the usual kind of format of the seminar, Ernesto is going to discuss the latest book by Patricio, Money is Not Everything. Funny enough, from Argentina, it's difficult to believe the title, but it has a subtitle that qualifies that. It's The Purchase and Sale of Sex in Argentina in the 20th Century. I think that you both and probably the audience know already the rules of engagement. You will have like 30 minutes to discuss the main contents and impressions of the book. Then we would open to the audience, to the floor, and we will go for another half an hour, 40 minutes. So Ernesto, after the discussion, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, Patricio, Christine, Paulo, and you, Alejandra. And thank you for inviting me. These reviews and presentations give you the opportunity of something that you wouldn't do otherwise many times, which is to read in depth things that are not from your field and engage with ideas, many of them very, very interesting, that might seem removed from where you usually work. So thank you really. And I will start with something very simple for Patricia, which is if you can describe a little bit what the book is about for those who have not yet read it. Your previous book, which I also enjoyed a lot, about the Frente de Liberación Homosexual, focused more on sexual identity and this very interesting and productive relation with the left in Argentina and in other places around. And you seem to expand this topic towards something much larger, both historically and thematically. So I was wondering how that process was.
Oh, well, thanks, Ernesto. Obviously, thankful Paulo, Christine, and Alejandra for the invitation. Well, as you said, when I finished my first book, it was about the radical homosexual movements in Argentina. I started looking at a project for my PhD, and I found first all these letters about Bergen requesting prostitutes to save soldiers about homosexuality. And that first, that was documentary sources, then led me to a huge material when I started looking, and I thought, well, this was done by a guy, like there's nothing new to do about it. But when I start like looking for more documentary sources, new questions come to my mind. The idea of my book is to place sexuality in the center and the core of the making of modern Argentina and the Latin of Argentina during the 20th century. It explores the diverse ways in which our broader range of actors and actresses exchange sex for sex for money, and try to understand what that can inform us about their life and about how sexuality was built in everyday life. So what this book does is to discuss or to challenge binary ideas about prostitutions or about the past, not just the contemporaneous now that we have now between abolitionists and pro sex work recognition, but also the title is challenging other narrations of the past, especially the ones that are relating more to conservative discourses or progressive discourses that trend to see prostitution just related to female weakness, to luxury, or for the poverty of the country. So going beyond this binary ideas, the book tries to understand how this diversity of ways of doing of selling or purchasing sex could be a door to understand how heterosexual desire and heterosexuality was practiced in the 20th century.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm gonna go back to the problem of the binary, but I wanted to start first. I'm gonna start with my going back or bringing you to my own field. And Iran, I've been working for several years already about feminism, and I had to read a history of prostitution to learn that, what is page 65, there's a letter in which I learned that Perón's first political struggle once he took office in the military government in 1943 was not about workers, was not about unions, but was a letter to the president requesting to open spaces for prostitution nearby military barracks, right? So the Argentine military could be healthy and satiated their instincts. I found that fascinating, of course, but I was wondering if that can give you the opportunity to talk about that specific moment, Peronism, but also post-war. What kind of man was the Peronist man, and how that reflected or was in tension with the Peronist nation that was built during that decade and with reverberations up to these days, right?
Thanks for the question. I think that's, well, the letter is amazing. In fact, there are two letters. It's a Peron endorsement as a young general to a claim of militaries about the right to have brothels in the barracks, to access to sex, and expresses a lot about how was the place that Peronism will give to sexuality in the political struggle. I'm thinking in other works, as for example, Maracha, but also now we can think about Natalia, etc. But I think also it talks about like two dimensions that are, I think, encrypted in Peronism: the continuity and the rupture. Between first, if we think in this continuity, there is an idea that it's not, I think, from Peron, but it's very wide among militaries and among other people like doctors or members of the elite journalists about the strategic, how male sexuality was strategic for the development of the nation, in particular in a nation that it's imagined as an empty nation that should be populated by workers, consumers, but also by soldiers, and how in this context of a post-war seeking a healthy but also a huge number of men to populate this country is important. So there is a part of this letter is more related with this consensus that they are not challenging. They are taking, and I'm sure then in the next question we can talk a little about what this consensus mean about what is male sexuality, or how they're imagining male sexuality. But also I think there is a second dimension about, well, he's doing a claim, Peron is performing a claim that I'm not sure is not totally related for her, for after advocacy of using of worker claims, that it's related to the idea of the rights of the worker to pleasure. You know, there is of the popular classes to pleasure. He has an idea in this letter in which somehow there is we can say a pre-Peronist idea about how these soldiers have a natural right, that it's part of their nature to access to these sexual services, and how these sexual services, how the state has to regulate them to guarantee that these services are healthy, you know, and they are protected. And that is something that you also will see, not just in Perón, but in the aftermath, and I write in the book about it, in other letters of, for example, trade union leaders, you know, that they are challenging this law that are punishing prostitutes, but also they are punishing sometimes workers. What they are arguing is about, well, this is part of the popular class's life. Like, you have to accept, like, what, we can't deny it. Like, we have to do something about it. And I think in that claim, even if also inside Peronism, there is the opposite, and I think that's part of what Peronism is now, this ability of having the both sides of the same thing. There is also a powerful claim about the right of enjoying this kind of pleasure for male. No? We're talking not for women. And this is connected, before we go to the same question, I think it's expressed in the attempts of Perón to reform the law of 1936 that abolished regulated prostitution. No, and we know that in the 44, the government of Farrell listened these letters, and he did this reform that allowed the state to create brothels in the barracks. In fact, in my book, I describe some projects and some that were, it seems, they have been developed about this. But also in the 64, in the 54, Perón tried to go back to the regulation of prostitution with a new law promoted by Ramon Carrillo, and that was one of the main companies that lead to the conflict between Peronism and the Catholic Church. And we know how it ended in 1955, now with divorce and other laws that were challenging the idea of moral sexuality that they have.
Yeah, no, so in one way or another, both regulation and abolition both claim to do it for the health of the nation, with different approaches, right? Something that I wanted to ask you when you were talking in the I think it was in the previous question about the male sexuality, about crucial for the strategic development of the nation, is during that period or during the entire period that you study, if at any point the connotation of prostitution or the fact of women being used or their sexuality being bought shows up as a problem for the dignity of the nation. And when you were talking, I was thinking about Cuba and the several tensions and contradictions and back and forth since the revolution about what prostitution meant. So in addition to male sexuality, how that women place relates to the nation in particular, right?
Well, as I say, like you have all these discourses of doctors, journalists, members of the late military, that even if they are sometime in different sides, now they are pro-advocating for regulation or abolitionism, they have like this dual conception in which, well, the idea of the law of 1936 is clearly, it's called law of social prophylaxis. There's a law thought in somehow to regulate or to guarantee to avoid the spread of venereal disease. So there is a concern about male sexuality. Also, there is a concern about women's. Now, and this law is especially boosted by the claims against Smithville and on all this crisis related to the apparently criminal organizations related with pimping. So there is an idea that, well, there's a lot of women that are victims of this men that are that are exploiting them. Also, in these discussions, there is well, it's not so simple. I know, as you say, we are related with a nation. There is a diverse range of discourses. For example, nationalist movements tend to say, like, well, Argentine women are more, they have a more strict moral sexual behavior than Europeans, especially the Eastern Jewish Europeans. So there is an idea that really they are corrupt. There's a forgetting corruption of their morality. But this idea will trend to dissolve with the advance of the century, because, like, immigration obviously didn't continue, no? So well, continue, but not in the amount that was in the beginning and until the 40s, no? But women usually appear as victims, or especially a victim, are imagined as victims in the public discourse. Then when you see how the law is applied, they appear as criminals, and they are they're punished by the state using this law in the practice, in the daily life, in everyday life. This abolitionist law that said that was used to protect them and to guarantee the right to sell sex, autonomous sex, sale of sex, will be used by police officers to achieve economical sexual services, or sometimes just to punish them and to control them. But by the practical use of this law. So, like, they are between, I will say, they were between victims in the private life, and in the public life they were victims in the public life, and in the private life they were criminals.
Okay. And that's pretty much even throughout the entire period, during the entire 20th century, or it has different emphasis at different times?
The repression of
that kind of characterization of women as both, yeah, including
the idea of women as victims, I think, is through the 20th century. It's still a very powerful idea today. You know, if we listen to the discourses around the debates about abolition of pro-work, the idea that it's a more complex idea of what it means, of how limited possibilities are for women and choose or not choose. It's a long debate to sell sex, but it's still a very powerful idea that keeps shaping the matter. Sure, today it's more complex and diverse, but I think that during the 20th century, there was a huge consensus about this. Even if I think, for example, this idea, the debates between conservatives and social reformers when they were more progressive, both in different ways, both thought that or was for the weakness of the women, or was because they were victims, that they were trapped in this impossibility of going out, of selling sex. And also they usually presented this idea of selling sex as a permanent condition, and as my book shows, it wasn't at all. Like, there are a lot of women that are selling sex sometime, they're not doing all the kind of jobs, or just moving to another things. So yeah, I think that in the public discourses, this idea is very, very spread and continuous. Obviously has different gray areas now, I would say, but yes, in a general view, yes.
Yeah. When I'm going back to the male side of the story, there's one subtitle that I love in its Spanish reverberations. There was biologically machos, socially disorganized, and naturally consumers. And in that section of the book, besides the appealing subtitle, you seem to locate sex trade as sort of a need of male breadwinners, so they can be healthy, so they can be good providers in the family, so the family can consume, right? And I find that fascinating, and it's almost as if you could locate prostitution and the Peronism without or within, or at least in conversation with the field of Peronism and consumption, where Natalia and Elena, for example, are working. how is that? I guess the question is, how is that different? That specific role of prostitution as consumption under Peronism? Because you mentioned in that section and in others, what is specific about the plebeian male, right, buying sex. But also, as you rightly says, the Kingsley report that you mentioned from the late 20s also said that workers already went more to the prostitutes than university students. So it doesn't seem to be something that started under Peronism. What are the changes there that you see from the 20s and 30s, from the 40s and 50s?
Well, yes, maybe the first idea I will emphasize highlight is that there is this consensus about how male sexuality is uncontrollable and is ungovernable. And I think this idea is interesting because it's a very powerful idea. If we think in the fact that during the 20th century, male citizens have been at the same time presented as rationals, and they have had more civil and political rights that other citizens. But I think that the side B of this idea of the male citizen as rational, we have also all this discourse about how male citizens are unable to control themselves because they have the physiological need. And this idea is spread in trial records, is spread in discourses, is spread itself by this man when they had to testify, for example, in trial records. This idea that they're in the bed, in the private of their life, they are totally rationals and they can't control themselves. And how this idea they are totally rational, it's a point from that I think articulates other dimensions. I don't want to repeat a little, maybe looking back to Peronism, but what maybe I can tell you about how I think my book contributes to think by trying to go through all these sources, between trial records, letters of trade unions, letters of Peron, etc. It's trying to more than looking these ruptures, it's trying to look more discontinuities, how even there is an apparent change more related with political periodization. There's also a long dimension that is more related with how heterosexual desire is being practiced and is being imagined. This doesn't mean that the Peronism didn't bring something new. I think that I'm sure of that, especially because if we think maybe in thinking with other texts, other works of other colleagues about how Peronism changed the gender embodiment of working class, about this idea of they have to be a male challenging against this oligarchy, that was imagined as female and feminine, and they have this new role. You also can rethink how this new position, and it's also shaping their daily discourses about their own sexuality and how they their ownership over this right to access to the sexual pleasure, to embody the sexual pleasure, and maybe then we have time now, but how they when they are called by police in trial records, for example, how they use this space to talk freely about their genitalia, their sexual acts, how they imagine themselves in that sexual acts, about their body, how they perform their body, and into this violent guns of power with which they become a kind of beast, or a kind of rational beast. And I think that has a political dimension. They're performing themselves or embodying themselves in this particular understanding of masculinity.
Impossible to contain and to restrain. Before they kick me out of my role here, And I hope maybe I have space in the Q&A to keep adding more questions. But I had one on the side that I mentioned briefly to you before about how does homosexuality come into the equation, beyond the fact that our prostitution and homosexuality are a little bit deviated from the norm. You work a little bit or more than a little bit, in the second part of the book about homosexuality and the way it is. It seems to be sort of lumped together with prostitution as the same problem, and it made me think about language, in particular in Spanish, how the word in Spanish puto became the masculine of prostitute became sort of a denomination for or against homosexual males. There seems to be a sort of a very direct, explicit, almost violent connection, but I don't know if that's common in other languages. If there's a specific history that we can trace in this lumping together similar different processes in a similar category.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, obviously, when I started writing this book, I wanted to do a turn because I thought that usually history of sexuality, especially like a queer approach to history of sexuality, was making questions about sexualities considered deviated sexualities, and I thought, well, this is a chance to turn my glasses and what happened if queer researchers start making questions about heterosexual desire, heterosexual history. Why should we be questioned, and how changing of turning this question back to what is considered normal could be useful to make it weaker, not weaker this apparently naturally condition of heterosexual, and show how it's also built over time. At the same time, homosexuality was built in the 20th century. But more in concrete, I think my book can contribute in two big dimensions to think what is the role of homosexuality related with this sexual commerce. First, as a fear, if we think like, well, Peronists have this big fear about if we don't have prostitutes, that men will all become homosexuals and they will start masturbating themselves, and this is a problem to the nation. But also if we think in a broader history, for example, of venereal disease, well, we can think there is also a connection, as you say, between putas and putas. Now, if we think that at the beginning of the early 20th century, prostitutes were related with syphilis, for example, or were thought as the main agents of contagious of syphilis. And if we think in the 80s, then the homosexuals of the gays, especially sexuality, will be criminalized of the main space of contagious of AIDS. No, like, and I think there's something related with this fear that it's connected, and also these worlds seem to be connected when you feel in the legal uses, now in the construction of the sexual order of the public space. Now, if you think on the uses of the moral codes used by police, this whole politics that started in the 30s of giving power to police officers, usually affected both at the same time, homosexual and prostitutes, because they were both undesirable subjects that were polluting the public sphere. And also the books contributes in a more social history dimension. In the beginning of the century, thinking, for example, in the participation of some characters, for example, cocotos, as they were called, were more a kind of trans subjects or non-binary subjects that used to live selling sex and to travel through different cities. There are different works about the reglementary area in which there are some few cases of men selling sex that were inscribed in these registers. But also the book contributes, as you say in the second part, to think what happened with these homosexuals became a market, or consumption market, not just an object that sells sex. For example, for taxi boys, or this kind of new subjects selling sex that are selling sex. that I think that are related with the consolidation of homosexual identity and the consolidation of a more stable market to this kind of services. You know, that, or at least more publicly, you know, it's more public in the press, because for sure there were other kind of sexual services offered for men by men during the 20th century. About the word, I can't answer, but I will say that I wrote a book chapter about the history of argot in Argentina, of gay argot in Argentina since the 19th century, that I can share with you about. But I don't remember exactly where the word puto emerged in Argentina, where it started to be used. But I think it was the first we found was in the 19th, at the end of the 19th century by La Nación. Started using this word. It was very interesting. But I can't remember exactly when.
Okay. I think that we can probably open to the audience for other questions. Unfortunately, I have not read the book, so I had listening to the presentation, I had very much the same curiosity that Ernesto put about the word and how it has been used and by whom. It's something that always sort of puzzled me. But I think I will have to read your other book about the chapter. So for the audience, if you have a more precise question than mine, or more specific, and if you want to either raise your hand, wave your hand on the screen, or just type it in the chat, I'll be very happy to read it and address it to Patricio. Or Maxine. Maxine's iPad, I guess, doesn't have a life on her own. So Maxine, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Alejandra.
Hello.
Patricio and Ernesto, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. Patricio, I have a question which may be kind of a bit later than the period that you've been talking about mostly today, but in your research, did you come across, or if you came across it, when did you come across it, the idea of sex work being work? And when was that attached to ideas of rights for prostitutes outside of the kind of, sanitaire kind of problem about, health and so on and so forth? I mean, that I always have associated with later phases of feminism, but you have found records of trades unions and so on. I just wondered if it appeared in an earlier period, even if formulated somewhat differently.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Maxime. Well, no. To be honest, I think that in Argentina, at least, the idea of sex work as a right could be could be related to the 80s, especially with I don't remember the name of this activist that is Rude. She's called Rude, and there is a very good book of Cecilia Varela recently published about her that is very interesting about the shaping of the idea of work as a sex work in feminism in the post-dictatorial Argentina. Because my book finished with the emergence of democracy, but my book discusses a lot about how these women understood their own job. Or what I try to do is through different records from, for example, their reports of the present, but also how their testimonies and the trial records. They try to negotiate what they consider that is a job. And usually what they consider to be a job is more related with other kind of economic activities. And they place this idea of offering sexual services as a complementary job they do to contribute, for example, to cleaning or to the harvest, and they do in this dead time where they are unemployed. But I can't do. But I can also thinking in other countries, especially Mexico. And I think there's amazing work of Peralta, Pamela Peralta, that for example, Mexico, you can see the first emergence of the first sex worker union in 1946, that I think is interesting.
Yeah.
And it didn't happen in Argentina. And when I read about it, it was like very surprising. In the case of Argentina, what you find is trade union leaders of male workers, even female workers, but usually they're men, talking about prostitution, but what they're representing is the right of men to access to sex work. They're not talking about the right of women. Women are seen as just victims, the ones that offer sexual services, but they are not imagined as subject of rights in general. But the rights to not be exploited.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'll chase you for those references.
Sure.
I see Christine has a question on the chat, but you'd like to make it yourself, Christine.
Sure. Thank you, Patricio and Ernesto. Very interesting conversation, and I look forward to reading the book. And I was wondering, Patricio, if you could say a little bit more about your sources, and you alluded to some of them already, but just tell us a little bit more about them. And in particular, I'm curious whether this is primarily a story about Buenos Aires and the conurbano, or whether you have any kind of glimpses into the degree to which these phenomena also kind of operate similarly in interior provinces, whether it makes sense to assume that those provinces are more conservative, or whether in fact they're kind of more similar than we might guess.
Thanks for the question. To be honest, my book is not about the city of Buenos Aires. In fact, it's just the first chapter to talk about it. It's more a book centered in the rural areas of Buenos Aires province. And I think that's, at the beginning, really, it was, to be honest, was because was the documentary sources I could access. And I thought, oh no, this will be horrible. I would have been able to do nothing. But then I found that there was a good strength about it, because going to that areas allowed me to rediscuss what historiography had said about sexual commerce, and to rethink a more diverse map about the sexual commerce. Like you say, what happened in these areas in which sociability is more close, is more personal, in which these sexual services are more related with all the kind of activities, not just to their factories or to their urban world, but also related with harvests, to the ports, to these mobilities between different cities, when you have all these workers moving from one city to another just to work, and how it allowed me to think how this multiplicity of ways of selling sex was also related with these regional and small dynamics, economical dynamics, but also to regional moralities, if we think. And moreover, I think that going in these areas, or especially in these areas of Buenos Aires, but also thinking in these letters that are from Patagonia and all the documents that talk about all the provinces in the north of Corrientes, etc. What allowed me to do is to rethink also how history of the sexuality of Argentina has usually designed a timeline very attached to Buenos Aires city. When you see, for example, that in the 60s, this idea of sexual revolution is not clearly impacting in cities of Chacabuco, in the middle of nowhere, not in the middle of nowhere, in the central of rural production, but not in the city. Now you see a lot of practices that are more related with a conservative world. And I think that's interesting about this geographical perspective of the book.
Well, I'm gonna call on Tom, because I know he's not from Chacabuco, so he's not gonna take offense. I'm from Bolivar, so mind you. Tom, you were next.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you, Patricio. Really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'll just ask a really specific question. I'm wondering, you talked about the military and it was really interesting to hear you flesh out some of the things I remember reading in Donna Guy's book, but she doesn't talk about them very much, and you've said a lot more. It's really interesting. So it's a key institution. I'm just wondering though, who's encouraged to form a family in the military? Is it just officers? Is it lower ranks as well? Presumably it's not conscripts. So what's and how does that affect discussion about, the management of sexuality? In Mexico, the case I know best, the military's attitude to family formation varies quite a lot over time. So I just wondered if that's the same in Argentina.
Well, the first thing to say is like this complaint started in Patagonia. So these militaries, what they are designing, what they are claiming, and then when they design after the law, it's for all the members of the military bodies. In fact, in their project, because they have some projects in which they explain how these brothels will work, that then I found some claims of members of the parliament that they existed, and then I interviewed a man that was conscript and was taken by the army to access the sexual services. Is that there was a design to separate the sexual consumption between conscript that should access to one kind of sexual services, and the more high hierarchies that they should be provided with a different sexual services, because they have this idea that was not a good idea to share the same women because the venereal disease, but also because I think there was an idea about hierarchies, about how this separation of worlds could work. Also in the interviews appear a lot about how there were all the kind of sexual services among the soldiers.
But presumably, are the conscripts supposed to have wives or even common law wives, or
in this
not really, right?
What they're claiming in these letters is that this is not the desirable decision, but it's the one they had in hand, right. Because they're in the middle. In this case, it's not Bolivar and Chacabuco is in the middle of nowhere. We're talking about a settlement in the army in the middle of Los Andes, in the mountains. So what they say is like the risk is obviously homosexuality, but also they, for example, attach some examples in which groups of soldiers are raping young women of the little towns. So they say, well, we can't punish them, because if the state doesn't start providing us prostitutes, they will start raping women of the area. So like, it's your decision, you choose. Well, that was part of building this claim. But to be honest, I'm not. In these letters, there's not reference or no desire of them, or they were not concerned about what will happen with this conscript. What their concern is about a solution for this particular time. In fact, for example, just another example, they bring some prostitutes of the area and make them sign a letter to show that they are agree to be part of this state-regulated brothels that the state will build for them. Mm-hmm. And also sometimes there are draws about how they should be and all
Gosh, wow.
So they're amazing. Yes.
Oliver, if I can see you now, so you're next.
Hi, Patricio. I was interested if you could maybe talk a bit more about how the history of prisons interacts with prostitution in the 20th century. So maybe thinking a bit, so as you were mentioning, this idea of the continuities, but also the consistencies, and how that might interact with how, at least in Buenos Aires, I don't know about elsewhere, how the female prisons were run by monks until the 70s, and how that might affect before and afterwards the experiences and treatment of these women.
Thanks, Oliver, for your questions. Yeah, my book deals a lot with prison, as you can imagine. The chapter 3 is about that. I access to the reports of the prisons, and what I did is building a huge databases about all the life of these women, that with all these documents through all the 20th centuries, since the 20s to the 80s. And what I try to do is to think how prison was a space of sociability, how in this space, they built knowledge about, well, how to deal with police, how to manage clients. There are some chronicles of women that were in the prison, and they talk about how there also were some kind of hierarchies between the prostitutes about who was the leader, no, the top, on who was less. So I think that the prison had a huge role in the shaping of the social networks of prostitutes, especially because it allowed them to build these networks. You find this reports people that was taken from Tandil to this prison in La Plata for a week. You know, it demands like a huge trip just for 7 days of imprisonment. And also these reports helped me to think how this law of abolitionist law was applied in a I don't have the word in my mind, but it was used to punish women, was used to negotiate with them which were the conditions of the sexual services, especially by police. Now that we know that in the progressive 20th century will gain more power. Since the 50s, they got the power to be judges. Judges at the same time have been the one that applied this kind of law. That is terrible. No, and so I think that the book deals and contributes a lot to that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Paulo, I've seen you have a question, and I've seen the one from Natalia that's been sitting in the chat. But it's a very good one, and I think that it's probably a good one to finish the conversation. So you mind putting your question now? You came later after Natalia, but I think that Natalia's question can make a very nice final question for the talk. Can
Sure.
I decide that?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Fine, good.
I was just going to follow up on Tom's question and your answer, Patricio, to just ask if you could say a bit more about how the idea of men as rapists shaped discussion of prostitution. You talked about that in the context of the army, but I wonder if you can say a bit more beyond just the context of the army, because the anxieties that you discussed earlier on in your answers to Ernesto focus on homosexuality and prostitution, but I think there's a third element to that, which is a different type of male sexuality that is reflected in the rapist. So could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, yep. The book, I think that deals with this idea by doing a history. First, like a more broader history about how male sexuality is imagined in general in Argentina. And I think this idea that it's uncontrollable is related with the fact that it's violent and has no control. Rape is considered as a normal, it's not named as rape, but some degrees of violence are considered legitimate to men to practice their sexuality. But the interesting thing is this idea that sometimes I think that seems abstract, and in other historiography seems more like a cultural construction of this idea. When we go to the history from below, to the trial records, and we see what these men are saying in the trial records, is not very distant from that. That's interesting. They are in the daily life, in the everyday life, they're embodying this idea by using some metaphors to talk about their own body or about their sexual acts. Now they use all these metaphors about how violent these acts are. I use I don't know, in Spanish, no, so el arma sin forro, no, so I use the gun to penetrate her, and because it's exalting this violent feature of the sexuality, I think is related with especially in front of the men, is related with challenging them and saying like, well, I'm the macho here, I'm the one, my sexuality is uncontrollable. But also how they talk about the genitalia. They use all these metaphors about genitalia as beasts, but genitalia there as guns, genitalia as part of a kind of nature. Usually they use metaphors related with rurality in general, with the idea of the natural order, and how I think that this all this, or also you can see that when they go to the justice, for example, to claim if they got a venereal disease and to claim the justice to catch these women because they commit the they should be punished for giving them a venereal disease, and how they see in this and the discourse, you see like how they're imagining this sexual encounter in which they are the owners of all the rights to in the sexual encounter, and the role of the women will be to care them, to provide them the care, and how they have this right to do it, especially if they are considered indecent women, non-moral women with a non-moral behavior. So I would think that even if not, obviously the word is not rape, because rape, they are not defined as some rapers, how this broader practice and broader imaginarium about male sexuality is shaping, in fact, allowing certain degrees of violence in the daily practice of heterosexual male desire. We don't go beyond. No, I was just remembering, it came to my mind that last year we have a judge that set free a group of men that rape a woman because they have an uncontrollable desire to penetrate her. And it was so surprising because it was exactly the same words that you find in all these trial records, that it seems to be very, they have penetrated a lot in Argentine imaginarium, that male sexuality can be controlled. So it's normal to expect that if they can't access to sexual services, they can get angry and furious. And the book trial to deal with art, not just in I think that the thing is like, it's not an abstract idea, it's a daily practice, and how it's built over time. It's in daily life, not in just in books.
Okay, well, there is an opportunity to make yet another question or comment on Patricio's and Ernesto's conversation, because I've been holding on a comment or a question from Natalia Milanesio that I think it could be a good way to end this conversation or discussion. So, you have your opportunity to speak now or shut forever. So then I'm gonna call on Natalia to put your question. Natalia, let's give it a try. Despite your connection is not very good or your micro is not very good, you want to try? Natalia? Okay, then I can read it. Natalia wrote very early on, I read the book and it's great. Congratulations, Patricio. Given the great historiographical production in the last few years, including the Renote for Peru, Sepia for Cuba, and Bliss from Mexico, where will the field in Latin America go from here?
Thanks, Natalia, for your question, for your words. This is interesting because while I was doing the book, really, to be honest, I did it in Argentina, in Quilmes, as you can imagine. To access to all this historiography, I had to use pirate things. I was dependent to access to this bibliography, very erratic, this access to erratic. So the building of the argument took me a lot of time to dimension how this topic was being built for the region. Thinking for the starting point, it could be Donagai, even if it's not the first book. I think that the field of the history of prostitution has become a bigger field in Latin America. As the history of sexuality also is becoming a more strong field that we could imagine 10 years ago. And I think that the interesting thing of the lost works are about 2 or 3 things. The first thing is the centering this idea of a history of prostitution, just as a reduced topic related to some kind of subject, especially to women or to the men who regulated the life. I think that new works, for example, the work of Paulo, but also I think in Laura Putnam work, they broader or give us a wide range of subjects to study how they interact in this daily making, even of the politic of prostitution. I think that is an interesting thing that is more clear in the last few years, and it seems to, I hope it will help us to deep in this area. And to use this area to deep, not just in prostitution as a topic, it's like as an excuse to think, and what I was talking about, male sexuality in general, of working class sexuality in general. And also this idea that is promoted by historiography related to the practices of salient sex as a topic of study, and not just a history of prostitution, because it allows us to go beyond fixed identities, that were related, or the last past work we're trying to do now, and to think in how these practices were articulated in broader context, on what they can tell us about this broader context, about this popular culture, about this regional economical social dynamics, etc. So I think that will be the two trends that I think that are interesting, that are very consolidated, and I think that they will grow. And I think that the third thing that maybe it's to be done is more related with sexual dissidence and sexual work in historical perspective. We know less about what was the participation of trans community, for example. My book deals a little with it, but we know, for example, Argentina in the 60s and 70s, travestis became very popular by offering sexual services, and in the 80s, and they have like well, my new project deals a little with it, but also all the kind of participation, I think, in homosexual or man-to-man sexual relationships that we should be ready to study.
Right. Well, Natalia says that her mic is not working, but I hope her loudspeakers or headphones did. If you have anything to add to that, Natalia, type it. We all are able to read your reaction. And that's the opportunity, or meantime, to add some other comments or question. I can see you, Natalia, now. It wasn't you in the video. If no other questions, then probably the time to wrap up, because it's 6:30. My behalf, thank you very much, Patricio and Ernesto, for this discussion. I definitely have the questions, so I will have to go reading it. This is the last seminar of the season. We will meet again after the summer. So it's a very good way to finish the temporada with this book. And thank you both, and thank you to the audience too.